Thanks for joining us today, especially if you're here in Philadelphia. I'm sorry we're not meeting in person, but don't worry. Once we get through all of this craziness, uh, we will get something on the calendar once we can meet safely and legally together. And if you're not in Philly and you're joining us, then this is great that the webinar is enabling more people to get together. I don't want to discount the value of being able to reach more people with the webinar. I know many of you joining us today, but for those I haven't met, I'm Austin Detweiler. I'm the managing editor of Philanthropy Daily and a senior consultant at American Philanthropic. We usually, co-host these events, so it's a bit less hosted as a webinar, but the same sort of feel. We also have Ian Bernhoft with us today. He's our main attraction. He's our speaker this afternoon. I will pass the mic to him in a few moments. For those of you who are sort of new to these events, Philanthropy Daily is an online journal of news and opinion on the nonprofit sphere. So we have lots of commentary on philanthropy and nonprofits, as well as practical advice for fundraisers to help you in your job. We believe that fundraising is an essential part of civil society that nonprofits make for a better culture. So we like to provide resources to help you thrive and help your organization grow. Philanthropy Daily is published by American Philanthropic, a consulting firm for nonprofits. We do all sorts of services to help you grow. Again, our interest is a thriving civil society, which means people gathering, people supporting nonprofits. If you have been a part of our weekly webinar series on fundraising during uncertain times, I'm glad you're taking the time to join us this afternoon. That series is focused on thinking about how to manage your fundraising efforts in the middle of the coronavirus pandemonium. Today, we want to get back to basics a little bit more. So some of my emails, I promised a reprieve from COVID content, so you can count on that for at least an hour today. Nothing we'll discuss this afternoon is irrelevant for fundraising right now. It might even be more relevant. If the stakes are higher in the midst of an economic downturn, then now more than ever, your story needs to be clear and compelling. And that's what we want to talk about this afternoon. So before we jump in, I want to encourage you to ask questions. You can use the chat function or the Q&A function. If you're unfamiliar, just hover your mouse right over the screen and you'll see the options down at the bottom. I'll review the questions myself, and then after Ian's presentation, he'll take as many questions as he's able to. If you've joined us for an event before, you know that we like the Q&A to be pretty interactive. We like everybody to be sharing ideas, bringing their insights. Unfortunately, we can't do that virtually, but we still want to provide as much value as we can. So as you know, our topic today is storytelling and fundraising. Successful fundraising, of course, starts with a good mission. That's the most important thing. But after a good mission, you need to work on communicating that mission to your donors and your stakeholders. You certainly know why your organization is worth supporting, but donors and certainly prospective donors, they don't know all the ins and outs. They don't know the value unless you can communicate that really well. So that is what we are here to discuss today. Ian Bernhoft is a professor of literature at Providence College in Rhode Island. His writings appeared in many outlets, academic outlets like National Catholic Register, and of course, frequently in Philanthropy Daily. He may even have appeared in your mailbox. Ian is a writer for American Philanthropic. He leads a lot of the writing projects for our clients. So perhaps you've seen some of his work, didn't know it. Ian's PhD comes from Boston University, and he lives now in Rhode Island with his wife and two sons. Ian, I will hand it off to you. Ian has a presentation for us, and then send your questions in. And once Ian wraps up, we'll go to Q&A. Thanks.
I'd like to echo Austin's words in welcoming everybody. Echo Austin's regrets, the fact that we are not doing this live and in person. And also, frankly, to commend you for your courage, because speaking as an academic, if I see that an English professor is teed up to talk about something like what is literature or the importance of storytelling, and I don't have a drink in my hand, that seems like a good time to head for the hills. So thank you for joining us today. And what I want to talk to you about is how the sort of very basic, fundamental human art of storytelling can in fact be fundamental to our fundraising, and how, even though we know it's important, we're still probably not using it enough. So let me give you a quick preview of what's about to transpire. We're going to begin briefly running through why are stories important in fundraising and thinking about the two major ways in which they serve us. And then we'll look at some concrete examples of categories of putting them to work. In terms of illustration, what I rather provocatively call dragon slaying, and in terms of building a shared identity. And then we'll wrap things up with concrete actions that we can do today. Austin, should I try to relaunch my video, or are we still?
I'm clicking around and coming up empty. So I don't know if you can share on your end, Ian, or if we can just lean on the PowerPoint here for a bit.
Okay, let me just try one more time. Yeah, it says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. So we'll just go like this for a while. Okay, so storytelling, the world's oldest profession, or one of them anyway, develops as in a way that offers us some real benefits. And as a somebody who teaches literature for a living, I don't want to reduce, far be it from me to reduce art to mere techne. But one way we can think about stories is firstly, and perhaps foremost, as a technology, a tool that serves us to make information more memorable on the one hand and more meaningful on the other. So before we had flash drives, before we had Nate Silver's 538, stories were a way for us to store up and make sense of the information offered us in the world. So on the one hand, I want to think about them at first as being a technology of memory. On the left hand of your screen, hopefully you see Greeks and Trojans fighting to the death. And the Homeric bards, Homer and his kin, were able to deliver the Iliad is almost 16,000 lines. It would take you a dozen hours or more to recite it. And they had all that in their head, in large part because the stories followed certain contours, certain recognizable patterns, which allowed them to develop a command of a huge range of information. Now, in the modern day, obviously things are different. We can't even retain phone numbers in the modern day because we've sort of offshored all our memory onto our devices. Nevertheless, stories still have this way of staying with us in a sort of sticky fashion. So I'm sure you can think of your own examples, but you can probably think of times where there's a conversation, a lecture, a sermon or homily, and you have no idea now, looking back, what else was talked about that day, what was discussed, but you remember the story. You remember the story that was told. And the reason for this, I think, is on the one hand, stories tend to be concrete as opposed to abstract, and on the other hand, being particular and not general. Furthermore, so on the one hand, they help us retain information, they stay with us for a long time. On the other hand, they also help us make sense of the world. And we habitually rely on stories to make sense of events, give causality, a sense of direction. And in this sense, I would call them a technology of meaning. And we love that about them, right? They give shape to the chaotic and potentially contradictory data of existence in a way that we can both remember and see something meaningful about it. Now, there's no need to belabor this point, I don't think, because nowadays everybody talks about controlling the narrative, getting out ahead of the narrative. All this talk about how we shape events has become de rigueur in media and public relations, and so on and so forth. But it's worth just emphasizing that as humans, we tend sort of instinctually to shun that which is chaotic or confusing or perplexing and embrace that which is simple, orderly, and intelligible. The Avengers is always going to be a bigger box office draw than the latest French film school offering. I should note on the side that with the picture of the Liberty Bell, I'm attempting rather feebly to pander to the hometown crowd. But I use this as a symbol of the way stories can generate meaning, in the sense that we think about, well, how does a cracked hunk of metal become a Liberty Bell? How does it become a must-see stop for tourists in Philadelphia? The city sort of, in some sense, is organized around, and that's through stories, right? Through the stories we tell about it, through the stories we tell about our nation and the place of this bell in our nation. So from this, we can see fairly apparently why a story has value to the fundraiser, insofar as they make information and ideas more memorable, more engaging, more compelling. So let's put them to work and try this out in real life. I'm sorry. There we go. Okay. So recalling those two technologies, this idea that stories are a technology of memory and a techne of meaning, this guides us into the major ways we use them. So first of all, to illustrate, and secondly, to engage. I'm going to talk about these one at a time. So in terms of using stories to illustrate, we might think about the way they bring to life, by exemplifying, bring to life our mission. And so here I've got two examples. The one on the left, I'll read out loud now. This is a hypothetical organization. Every year, we offer clothing assistance to people in need. This can be really helpful in offsetting or escaping poverty. So that's Exhibit A. Now we turn to Exhibit B. Diego didn't know where to turn. He had lined up a job interview that could secure him the income necessary to escape homelessness, but he had no clothes for the interview. Thanks to our clothing assistance program, we provided him with a sharp shirt, tie, and slacks. He came back a week later to share the good news. He'd gotten the job. Okay, what's the difference between these two? The first, they both talk about the mission of this organization that's, giving clothes to people who need them the most. They're both making claims about why that's important, but the first one speaks in the language of generality and of abstraction, right? So we give clothing assistance. It reduces homeless clothing deficits. So it's all very abstract. And even though there's numbers and so on and so forth, it doesn't really come to life. The other, by putting it into a narrative, we all of a sudden, it's invested with a lot more compelling, and it's invested with a lot more pathos or emotion. Because a story that we can envision, okay, this guy has a chance towards a better life. The only thing standing between him and that is a decent suit of clothes. We gave him those clothes, and now he has that better life. That's something we find moving in a way that talk of percentages, talk of social media impact, talk of clothing assistance isn't going to do. So the latter engages the intellect and the emotions, not just the intellect. And this is an issue that we work a lot with clients on. We see a lot that sometimes there'll be the tendency to just talk about, the measurable things, the policy wins, the online clicks, the test scores that have improved. All those things are great, but they don't really move donors. And so instead we turn towards the level of detail, specificity, and that's where I think your mission can really come to life. Now, let's move from, this is again sort of on the level of illustration, let's move towards something more fundamental and think about how storytelling ought to inform the very structure of your fundraising material. And this is something, if you're interested, I wrote a little bit on Philanthropy Daily about this last year. But what I want to assert is that storytelling ought to inform the structure of your fundraising, because there are certain structures of storytelling that are very much wired within us. They're sort of well-nigh universal. And I call this a sort of fairy tale structure. And we all know, right, how a fairy tale goes. You have once upon a time, and there's a princess in a castle in a forest with a king. And that's analogous to the context, sort of the basic setting or situation. Into that world comes disruption, comes a dragon, a witch, something like that. We'll go with the dragon today. So one day a dragon descends upon the kingdom and starts to do what dragons do. And this is a problem. And so this is analogous to the issue that you're facing, that your organization is tackling. And then there's an assertion of why it matters, of what the consequences of this are. So soon the dragon's fire engulfed all the villages, laid waste the countryside, etc. We see the urgency of this problem. You can't just dwell with this dragon. This is a dragon that's going to pose an existential threat. And then again, we know how fairy tales end. The princess develops new powers, a knight rises onto the scene, somebody slays the dragon, and everybody lives happily ever after. And that's the resolution of the issue that's disrupted, it's consequential. Now, once you start looking for this structure, you'll see that it's well nigh universal in effective writing, effective persuasion, effective public speaking. We see it in commercials, in business ideas, in grant proposals, in investigative journalism, and we also see it in effective fundraising. So, you see somebody efficiently establish a context, introduce a problem that they're trying to solve, map out why this matters, why you should pay attention, why you should care, and then resolves it. Let me give you a couple of hypothetical examples. Again, these are not real clients. This is just hypothetical. The first one is a policy proposal. Okay. America has long prided itself on being a land of opportunity for its robust, active citizens, is the context. Yet today, millions of Americans fall victim to morbid obesity and heart disease brought about by a steady diet of corn syrup and table salt. Okay, so we have a problem. Something has disrupted this robust health of our citizens. Unchecked, this trend imperils workforce productivity, overburdens the already failing healthcare system, and undermines national vitality. So there you have consequences. This is bad news. And then we turn to the words of resolution. By shifting our massive corn subsidies over to cauliflower, sweet potatoes, and chard, we can incentivize healthy eating and effectively combat this national disaster. So there's the resolution. So that's the world of policy. We could take a shot at the world of fundraising. Studies have shown that playing musical instruments greatly aid cognitive and emotional development. Here's an established fact, it's context. But such musical training is unavailable to countless students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds at under-resourced schools. Now we have a problem. A deprivation that heightens present and deepens future inequality. And so this is a consequential problem you should care about. What our organization strives to do is to make musical training available to students of all backgrounds, thereby enriching underserved communities and improving the lives and future prospects of students. So there we have the mission delivered as a solution to the problem that we've established. Now, one thing I want to emphasize is that in order to really sort of harness the rhetorical sort of instinctual power of this, what I'm calling this fairy tale structure, you have to deliver the goods clearly and in this order. So it wouldn't make sense for the knight to slay the dragon, then for you to backtrack and talk about how bad the dragon's fire was, then mention the princess's kingdom, and then tie things up by talking about how the dragon arrived one day. That eviscerates the power of the story to compel your reader forward towards feeling the urgency of the problem and thus the timeliness of the solution. Okay, now, this leads us into the third point. So of what I think stories can do if we use them well, and that is to build shared identity. Where if we're continuing to think about this four-part structure of context, problem, consequences, and resolution, the place where you want to insert your donor or stakeholder and your own mission is between the dragon and the village, basically. So I have this bootleg chart of the Simpsons watching, I believe it's Game of Thrones, or it's something like that. But either way, you see there's the dragon burning the villages. You need to, in your material, present your organization and by extension, your supporters as stopping that dragon in its path and thus saved from the day. And what we do when we present our work in a compelling fashion in this way is your audience, the stakeholder or the donor, is going to feel interpolated into the story. They're going to, in some sense, identify with the cause and with its resolution. This is instinctually what we do when we read fiction, right? Or when we watch a movie, we identify with the protagonist. So regardless of whether your dragon is a dragon of illiteracy or cancer or a depleted art scene, recidivism, bureaucratic inefficiency, it doesn't matter. Whatever your dragon is, you need to make the donor feel that they're the ones who are putting it in its place. Now, what this does is it creates a strong sense of identification between the organization, between your mission, and between the donor. And so you become aligned with that. And you certainly want to call attention to this fact. So you might say, I know that dragon slaying is important to you, dear, reader. And that's why you are committed to this work. And if they didn't necessarily care about your mission previously, or prospective donors, right? They, on some level, instinctively do now. Again, in the same way that we instinctively root for the protagonist of a book or a movie. Okay, so to recap where we've been so far. Point number 1, stories are a powerful technology for remembering information and for imparting meaning. And because of this, we should employ them heavily in our fundraising efforts. On the one hand, to illustrate our work, to bring the work we do to life and have it stay in the donor's mind. And on the other hand, to engage the donor in a sort of dramatic story and thereby promote their identification with our work and their willingness to join it. And so we do this on the one hand through vivid and personal examples, and on the other hand through the fairy tale structure of context into which a problem is introduced with consequences that you resolve. And so your organization, with the donor's help, is the knight that's going to vanquish that dragon. Okay. So my impression of the working world is that from time to time we want things which are actionable. And so as we think about concrete actions of how do we take this, how should we apply these ideas into our own fundraising efforts? One thing that I would emphasize the importance of is gathering stories of your organization's work in action. So concrete examples of what you're doing to help people, anecdotes of people who have been helped or things you've done, and also personal testimonies. And I mean, this is speaking from the writing side of things, this is a major hurdle a lot of the time with a lot of different groups, because when nonprofits are putting together fundraising and we say, okay, do we have stories that we can work with? A lot of time they don't have good stories, right? Because they haven't necessarily just collected them, assembled them. So it requires that extra effort of going out, talking to clients, talking to the people in the field, and getting that stuff on record so that then you can use it to enrich your material. And I would also say that you want this material not just to stay in the back end, but become visible to donors as well, in terms of having examples on your website, of having pull quotes, of testimonials, of having lift notes that can accompany direct mail. All these things I think are really valuable in bringing your mission to life and helping people feel an emotional connection to it. So that's with regards to using stories to illustrate. With regards to using stories to engage your reader, or your audience, your donor. On the one hand, I would say this process begins by looking back over your existing copy, be it grant proposals, direct mail, whatever client-facing materials you have, prospectuses, etc., and just go through it and really highlight, different colored highlighters, whatever you need. Highlight, okay, where do we establish the context? How do we lay out the problem? Where do we point to the consequences of the problem? And then how do we show the way we're resolving it? Now, I'm guessing that all that stuff is already in your material already, but I think that there's still a lot that can be gained at the margins by revising it, by striving to simplify any kind of like places where it gets bogged down or overly complex, to keep a clear through line on the story. To strengthen a sense of logical causality between like, here's the problem, and that leads directly to these consequences, and this is how our work sort of like emanates in a response to that and how we solve it. And also to thereby amplify the immediacy of the problem and your solution to it. And as you do that, I think the one thing that's important to do is to carefully think about how are you framing the problem and its consequences, because usually there's like a lot of different ways you can formulate it, right? You can approach the issue from different angles. And so you want to think about what's most likely to compel your donors. And especially what's likely to be sort of viscerally or instinctually compelling to them, and not just in addition to being rationally compelling. And so when I'm working on developing copy, my attention always begins with, okay, how can I articulate the problem in a way that seems urgent? And everything else kind of flows from there. But I think that that's the part to really hone in on and make sure that that's laid out in really like concrete, simple, clear terms. And then ultimately, I think the thing you want to check for in terms of using stories to promote identification is, do you have these assertions and these reassertions of shared commitments, shared sense of purpose, a shared mission that you're working on with the donor over time, and from that, a shared sense of identity. And so I think that just about wraps up my end of things. It looks like I'm still speaking in the dark, like Homer in that respect. But yeah, I'd be happy to answer questions.
The first question I have, Ian, this actually came in over email ahead of time. How much is what you're describing in terms of like, when we use the word storytelling, it can seem like we mean making stuff up, right? How much is this sort of like dishonest or deceptive or something like that, as opposed to like just presenting the facts?
Yeah, so I would want to disassociate storytelling from lying, or from just fabrication. And then what I'm instead trying to emphasize is, on the one hand, stories that are sort of real life stories of particular people who have been aided by your mission or who are committed to it. And on the other hand, shaping your work in a way that has this sort of structure of tension and resolution in that respect. Now, I mean, one thing, I think there's a place for invention. For example, if you don't have concrete anecdotes of people who have been directly aided by your mission, you can cook something up, but you have to present it as a hypothetical. And I don't think you can be dishonest about that. You say to your donor, imagine the single parent who's doing this, that, and the other, and this is how we help them. And so you can still paint a sort of imaginative picture in a way that's honest. And so, yeah.
Cool. Is there anything, it might be honest, but is there anything sort of manipulative when you're talking about appealing to the instinctual aspects of your potential donor as opposed to, the rational side?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, because I think that to a certain extent, we tend to associate emotional or instinctual appeals with something. There's something shady about them. Everybody dislikes the kind of like over the top direct mail tactics, right? Of trying to inspire, like fear and so on and so forth in people. And I think we have a native distrust of emotional appeals. We associate them with manipulation potentially. I think that distrust is misplaced. I think that one thing that's an essential thing to recognize about effective fundraising is that donors give for largely irrational reasons. Now, what I mean by that is if you look at surveys from, I think, Giving USA and places like that, of like interviewing donors, ask them, why is it that you give to the organizations you give? What motivates donors far more than questions of efficacy or strategic investment or all these things we pay lip service. What motivates them far more is a sense of an organization, a sense of identifying strongly with a mission. And so I think that appeals to emotions absolutely have an integral, essential part in fundraising. And I think that, in sort of classical rhetoric, this was recognized as well, that part of rhetoric is appealing to your audience's desires, their passions, their identity, and not simply their reasoning mind. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Actually, I'm intrigued about the mention of like appealing to identity there. Obviously, that's something that we talk about a lot at Philanthropy Daily, that Jeremy talks about the role between the donor's identification with the organization. Can you unpack that a little bit more in terms of the relationship, how you want to bring that out of your donor, and maybe how that relates to classical rhetoric?
Well, I think that the question of shared identity originates from these assertions of shared values or shared communities. And so that's why I think it's so important to sort of like limn your copy and your fundraising materials with appeals to certain principles, certain values, certain ideas that invite the donor to sort of silently, yes, equality is important to me, musical education is important to me, this mission to bring music lessons to inner city schools, this is something which is integral to my identity insofar as it's avowing things that are important to me. So I think, and then, as obviously you can do this more with people who've been giving for a while and talk about like, oh, this is what we've accomplished together. Look how far we've come. All this sort of language of aligned activities, I think, promotes this idea of like, this is something that involves you. This is something that you can feel is a component of who you are and what you've accomplished.
One of the image you had in there of the Simpsons watching Game of Thrones. So you set it up as essential that we have a dragon slaying thing. Is it always negative, more crafting this, or are we like playing into donors' fears and lesser angels, so to speak?
No, I don't think it has to be that way at all. I don't think it is that way at all. Obviously, I am leaning toward, I'm recognizing the importance of fear as a motivating factor. But you can think about opportunities and missed opportunities as also being in the same way. You can couch it in positive terms, basically. So you might say, we have the opportunity to eliminate cholera in country X. The only thing standing between us in that is this shortfall of whatever in our distribution systems, and you can help us with that. And so there, the work you're doing as a positive good, as an opportunity that can be realized, that's still inviting the donor. That's still implicitly saying, this isn't going to happen unless you step in and help us make it happen. And I think that's using the exact same rhetoric. I mean, the structure of a fairy tale also, it can be about disaster, right? It can also be about love as well, right? And so in that sense, there's nothing necessarily inherently fear or negative based about it, but there does need to be an unmet need which is resolved. And that's, I think, universal.
Mm-hmm. This is a professional interest of mine. This is my own question because I struggle with this. So when we're writing direct mail copy, it's usually pretty dumbed down to like, third, fourth grade reading level. And a lot of organizations out there are doing much more complex work than that, or have, maybe intellectual missions, or it's not just sort of like, it's not as basic as the copy there. Is there a way in direct mail to introduce nuance?
So I think that the way I conceive of direct mail is not, this isn't a second guess you, Austin, but it's not so much, I think it's not the right approach to think, okay, I have to make this pretty like stupidly simple, but rather it's still respecting the situation of your audience or the needs of your audience. If you imagine, okay, this is a person with better things to do who's deigned to crack open the envelope and skim this. And so what we're trying to do, when we write direct mail, is write it in such a way that it pops off the page to that skimmer in a way that they can immediately grasp it. Now, so I mean, I think that's what dictates a lot of the simple sentences, the bolding, the short paragraphs, is you just want to make it easy to read. And that doesn't necessarily involve sort of like intellectually hamstringing your operations. I do think that where there's a place for nuance, and I think you can sprinkle some of that in, you can allude to it, you can add it. But I think that where you can't have any nuance is in terms of laying out the problem and how you're solving it. That's where it needs to be simple, crystal clear, etc. And I think it's fine to get into the weeds a little bit more later on as you're sort of going into more depth for the person who's along for the ride, so to speak.
We have one question coming in. Do you have, can you recommend any resources that you've found helpful to think about storytelling and fundraising?
Resources to help think about storytelling and fundraising, did you say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what are maybe some books or other resources you've used to develop these ideas?
I think this is a sort of nerdy intellectual answer, but not intellectual answer, this is a nerdy teacher answer. But the whole fairy tale structure I've ripped off from an undergraduate writing guide that I teach. It's the Turabian Guide to College Writing by Kate. This is University of Chicago, I think. And that, a lot of it is not relevant to the fundraiser, but there's a few chapters in there that, for my money, are just gold. I come back to again and again. One of them is this idea of how to build up an introduction to or proposal in this pattern that I laid out to you today. And another is guide to sort of like writing clearly and effectively, and what sort of principles to apply there. I mean, in terms of fundraising, I think I'm fairly undereducated in terms of, I mean, I read Philanthropy Daily. I've watched some TED Talks about storytelling and about rhetoric, but I don't have like a good reading list. I don't know if you could supplement at all, Austin.
I mean, I know we've emailed and you've referred to in some of your Philanthropy Daily articles, Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, which I haven't made my way through entirely yet. But could you give us like a quick laydown about that?
So Haidt's book is great, I think, for thinking about this idea of appealing to the emotions as well as to the intellect, because the fundamental idea of his book, In the Righteous Mind, is that our moral judgments, in fact, precede our reasons for them. So that he says, and he draws on a wealth of sort of biological and social and cultural evidence to argue that we already have an opinion about something, and then or a disposition towards something, which we then our brain comes up with the reason for. And he says that this doesn't invalidate the place of reasoning; it doesn't somehow discredit it. You have to recognize that the way we work mentally and biologically is that our impulses, our subconscious processes, our habits, our instincts, all of these are so much more powerful and prior to our rational mind, that he compares the rational mind to a rider atop an elephant. And the rider is directing the elephant, one would hope, giving it the nudges of which way to go. But at the end of the day, the movement is coming from the elephant, and the elephant can easily overpower that rider. And so I think what Hyatt's work reminds us of is that it's essential, and also I think not dishonest, to be speaking towards people's sense of identity, people's emotions, people's sort of prior affective commitments of feeling attracted to things, repelled to things, and not seeking to just rationalize everything.
This is a little bit outside your wheelhouse, but I'm curious what you think about it. Thoughts on the role of design and visuals in articulating the message, so to sort of accompany the copy?
Yeah, that is in my wheelhouse. I mean, I think it's important. I think that, especially insofar as my prejudice is always towards the primacy of the written word, right? Or the spoken word. And this is where the magic happens. And that's my own a priori instinct, which I seek to rationalize to you after the fact. That being said, obviously, I think design elements can really make a huge difference where our attention is directed, how we receive something, how we internalize things. You want to add anything to that, Austin?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of just sort of straight white mail, you mentioned like white paper mail, that is. You've mentioned bolding, short paragraphs, short sentences, so that it's easy. So there's design that goes just into the way you structure the copy. Somebody asked here about statistics that we know about how imagery and visuals help. The main thing that we can say is do lots of testing. When you're sending mail, you want to have at least an A and a B test to figure out whether your donors or prospective donors like to see headshots of the president or CEO in the letter, whether you want like really designed fancy letters or whether they should be more pared down. And it really does change organization by organization. One thing that's interesting, Philanthropy Daily has an article from a long time ago reporting on a story about using what they call poverty porn. So sort of images of like poor kids in the letters to motivate donations for like a human services organization. And it turns out they don't work that great, actually. It's sort of like we criticize this a lot when you're saying like send money now, we're going to shut off the lights, or we have to close the doors or fire everybody by Thursday if we don't get $1 million. You might see quick gifts right away, but donors aren't going to stick around because they've not been engaged in actually in advancing your mission or identifying with your organization, but just saving you at the last minute. It's the same kind of thing. Go ahead, Ian.
I would add to that. That's an example of, you send out pictures of starving children or whatever. In a way, that's sort of throwing kind of unassimilated data of the world at the reader in a way that's potentially going to just bewilder them or turn them away from you. That you haven't articulated it necessarily within a story in a way that they feel empowered to do something about it over time. And I think that's what narrative can add that images aren't necessarily going to do. If you're relying on horrific images or sort of like troubling images, or even whatever kind of images, unless you've articulated them within a framework where the reader feels or the donor feels this, like you were saying, the sense of identification and to see the importance of action, I think that it's not going to do a whole lot for you.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of it might get a quick gift out of somebody because they feel bad about this, but that's where I think you're actually flirting with manipulation, right? It's sort of exploiting images of kids out there. We did have a client where we've tested. They do serve families in need and poor families, and they use images, and it's often the case, and I think this is the case in that same study. I can send the link around from Philanthropy Daily later, but it's actually usually happier kids that perform better, so to speak, in the mail, because people don't want to feel like you're taking advantage of them or exploiting them, and the main thing in terms of visuals versus words is you want them, as Ian's saying, to like work together, right? So you want the narrative to give context to the image, and the image maybe to bring the narrative to life, but you can't have one without the other.
Yeah, I think some organizations, right, they've done really well in terms of sending pictures of people who have been helped. Like I remember my parents got so excited a long time ago when they started giving some charity, where they were sponsoring a specific person, so photos and notes and whatever from that person were coming back, and that again, it makes you feel that there's a personal connection, and some sort of like result to your share or your results you're giving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that personal connection, the identity that comes from that is really valuable, which is one of the reasons we find that sharing a headshot of the president or CEO often works in direct mail letters. Just drop that in there, because then you sort of see the letters coming from Ian asking, for money to support your organization, and now you can see who it is. It just puts a face to the name, quite literally, and makes the relationship more personal. One more question here. Do you have any thoughts on how to get donors to identify with? So you've got an organization that does really sort of heady, complex stuff. How are we going to bring that down to achieve what we're doing here? So if you can't have a picture of a kid, we can see what to do here. But what if you're doing ideas or something like that?
I think ideas, no matter how heady and complex, are still motivated by some sort of simpler value or priority that people attach to. So say you're doing, advanced policy work in some sort of field, but still the end result of that policy is presumably some sort of greater human flourishing. And so I think that insofar as you can, the details of the sort of like the heady abstract work aren't important, but rather what are the goals that are guiding that work, and what do you hope the sort of human productive outcomes to be? And I think that just that's going to be applicable to anything I can think of.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, one of the things we're usually telling clients is you need to make sure you have a clear mission and a clear vision. The mission is what you're doing, but the vision is what the world looks like if your mission works, right? If you get there, and whatever you're trying to do, if it's heady or head in the clouds or whatever it is, you need to give some clear image to what the world looks like if you're successful. Spend some time hammering that out and draw it out and give it content and color. And then that's your pitch and mail, right? Is here's the specific way that the world is different if we have success. And that might not be this person or this neighborhood or something like that. But it's concrete.
Yeah, that's the coming back to this idea of having a so what, having well, why does it matter that we do what we do? Why should we care? And that's part really emphasized as well, I guess.
Awesome. Well, we're coming up on the end here, Ian, so I'm going to cut us off here so we're respectful of everybody's time. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. If you have any further questions, feel free, obviously, to be in touch with me by email. I can put you in touch with Ian if you want to talk to him, too. We're happy to keep the conversation going and keep answering your questions. Sorry again about the tech issues. I spend most of my day on Zoom now. I think I have it figured out, but it keeps happening. While I have you, I'll give one last plug to our webinar tomorrow. So it's every Thursday at 2:00 Eastern time. We're discussing fundraising during coronavirus. Tomorrow's events. It's the topic we received the most questions about. If you host fundraising events, you're probably losing some amount of money, whether great or small. And tomorrow we'll be thinking about how to recover lost revenue, how to reschedule events, cancel events, communicate it well to your donors. So come for that if you're interested, or just check out Philanthropy Daily for what else we have coming after that. We know that a lot of people are suffering right now, just in the professional space fundraising in the midst of the economic downturn. So we're doing what we can to help you out. If you have any questions, please just be in touch.